who is visiting us, has been visiting us for the whole of this academic year. So he's currently the Cook-Crone Research By-Fellow at Keys, as well as a visiting fellow with views, and also based in Fames as well. And he's published widely on various aspects of Semitic languages, and more recently turned his attention towards the early alphabet and the way it developed. And today he's going to speak to us on defining the word in early Semitic writing, ancient scribes, and modern theories.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I crossed paths with Pippa before I was here because of her previous project, Cruise, which is so conceptually and empirically interesting. So it was a treat to find myself here and be able to be a visiting researcher at a new project, which is I don't know how you do the acronym so well, but it's great that you.
Thank you.
Could you click it? It's start.
Yes.
All right. Okay, we'll get started. As the corpus of early alphabetic inscriptions from the Bronze and Iron Ages has grown over the past century, scholars noticed that the division between words was not always marked. On the one hand, there are texts like the one on the right, 19th century text roughly from the Sinai site of Sirabit al-Khadim, which has no word dividers. On the other hand, there are texts like the one on the left, which is from the 9th century, the Moabite Meshat stela, which has really beautiful, I think this might not work. No, I can't point to them, right? You're right. But little dots dividing the words very beautifully. And in roughly contemporaneous same century Aramaic text from the Tahariya, a different way of marking word divisions, but equally clear, equally bold. So clear word divisions in some texts and none in other texts. So why this difference? Taking just the text on these slides as our data points, the most obvious suggestion would be diachronic development. Earlier texts don't have word divisions. Later texts, remember it's 1,000 years later, do have word divisions. Half a century ago, there was a very influential survey of the practice of word dividers by Alan Millard, who showed that in the Iron Age, it was the norm to have word division throughout Northwest Semitic. Following up on that, Joseph Navet, I couldn't get a good high-resolution image of him, unfortunately, but Joseph Navet then wrote a brief note arguing that actually word dividers co-evolved with alphabetic writing itself. And he suggested that the reason that the word division was absent from certain texts was not a question of history of technology that hadn't been developed yet, but related to different genres or literary registers or writing styles. So today I want to argue in this paper that the scribal practice of dividing words is not, in fact, as old as the alphabet, and didn't, in fact, develop over the following 1,500 years or so, but it developed erratically. More importantly than the specifics of the history, I want to argue that the practice of dividing words was not actually just a technical development, how do we mark word division, but a conceptual development. And that the real innovation is not the word dividers, those dots or spaces or whatever a scribe may use, but the very idea of words being divided. In other words, the concept of words being autonomous units. There is often no clear answer to the question of where one word ends and another begins. And so what I'm going to try to suggest is that orthography and metalinguistic analysis of the language had to develop in tandem to produce the end result that we often see in text, which is regular scribal practices of word division. I do want to just mention that the most important work on the subject since Millard and Navet in 1973 is definitely Robert Crellin's 2022 book, The Semantics of Word Division in West Semitic Writing Systems, which was written under the auspices of Pippa's previous Cruise project. And it's quite an excellent book. The questions that I'm addressing here are different from the questions that Crellin works on in his book, but I've benefited a lot from that book and also from conversations with Robert. All right, so let's start with the oh no, that's all right, my fault. Doesn't matter, translation is the important part. Let's start with the problem.
That's it, the division between the words.
That's true, that's true. That was what I was trying to show. Maybe you can even read it without just by intuiting the words. Let's start with the problem of words. The concept of the word is actually subject of a fairly deep paradox. So on the one hand, it seems to us entirely intuitive, the most basic unit of language, obvious to the ear as I'm talking. You're hearing words. If I asked you to pause and how many words I just said, you could probably figure that out because our brains actually process that. Also obvious to the eye as you read. We speak about things nonchalantly, like children learn 14,000 words by the age of 6. As if that's an obviously clear statement what that means to learn a word. We have spelling tests, at least I have spelling tests, I don't know what you have, that consist of lists of words that I have to memorize, and we measure our length of texts by how many words they contain. I'm not going to tell you how many are in this, lest you think it's too little or too much. On the other hand, theoreticians have a very hard time pinning down just what a word actually is. And a clear and unambiguous definition of a word is extraordinarily elusive. It actually gets harder and harder the more we look for it. The problems begin, of course, on the acoustic level. So long before writing, we have speech and spectrograms, which I thought I had, but I guess not, of actual speech do not show breaks in between words within phrases. And so if you listen to my speech, there's no break in between any of the words that I'm saying. And if I pause in between every word I said, you would think that would be very strange. Actual speakers, even in antiquity, were very aware of this. And this passage from the Talmud, which is concerned about proper pronunciation, and therefore is concerned that there be pauses between words, is attuned to the fact that certain words, if they run together, will actually be inaudibly separate words, and therefore would not be a what they call a careful pronunciation. So if you look at the examples at the end of the passage, you notice that there are words, phrases, where the last letter of the first word and the first letter of the second word is the same. So in such a case, you would hear al levavecha without any pause and without any acoustic break at all. And so the rabbis are concerned that one not recite certain things in that way without marking those divisions. More modern times, assuming you can see through that box that says computer, this is from Edward Sapir, who thought that on the one hand, any competent speaker would intuitively know what a word was, but also conceded that he could not offer a precise definition. You can read his reasoning there. And in the intervening centuries since passages such as this, there's been actually a sort of erratic amount of work on the concept of wordhood. There have been some attempts to devise tests for what a word is or is not. Recent work has made two complementary conclusions clear. On the one hand, the category of word contains many clear examples where everyone will agree that that is a word, and some fuzzy examples around the margins where native speakers will disagree as to whether that is or is not a word. And the second conclusion is that there is a difference, at least between phonological words and grammatical words. And in a few minutes, we'll see that there's even other ways of dividing this up. So even the concept of word has to be nuanced and refined. If you ask, is that a word? One might have to ask, well, what do you mean by word? What kind of word are we thinking about? So if this is true and word is such a slippery concept, then why, to go back to the paradox, does it seem to us often like words are primordial entities that are easy to identify? Well, for most of us, this is actually a function of writing itself. Our own scribal practices create the illusion that the word is a stable concept. If we're forced by orthographic convention to leave a space before and after some string of letters, then it seems clear to us that we have defined what a word is. And the truth is, as interesting as the modern linguistic thinking about the word is, for philologists investigating how ancient scribes may have thought of words, these reasoned arguments are not the most useful point of reference. Much more useful, and this was emphasized back in the 1960s by the classicist and linguist Henry Honigswald, how do regular speakers, both illiterate and literate, think about words? So in other words, especially illiterate speakers, if I ask, so, everyone around this table is hyper-educated and spends a lot of time with texts, and that shapes the way we think about words. If you want to know, well, how did ancient scribes think about it as they're inventing a way of writing, then the most useful comparison is actually to find people who have not spent endless hours and years focused on written text, but instead people who just have intuitive senses of what may or may not be a word. So this is sort of the folk conception of a word. And regular speakers, even people who are literate, often have a hard time deciding. So this is a point made by Leonard Blumenthal, but I'll move on. Sorry. Okay, must have put something out of order. All right. People have a hard time deciding about words like birthday or shouldn't. Even people who are literate have a hard time just puzzling out whether those are one word or two words. Orthographically and phonologically, they're attuned to the fact that this is one word. Stress patterns indicate that it's a single word, but both, of course, have very transparent etymologies that suggest to people who speak the language that maybe this is not a regular word. Maybe this is something more than a single word. In the case of shouldn't, there's of course also the fact that the contraction is optional, so I can actually spell it out and leave a space in between should and not, for whatever reason I might want to do that. And speakers often also notice that there's no obvious difference between birthday and wedding day, not semantically and not phonologically, and only in my spelling practices do I have to not leave a space between birth and day, but yes, leave a space between wedding and day. And so this tends to confuse people. And that confusion is really the point, because this is a fuzzy category. There are cases that are simply not clear. There is no right answer to these questions as to whether these are single words or more than one word. Now, again, literacy tends to complicate the picture, because literate speakers who are asked about these things often fall back on their own spelling practices as a way of answering it. So they know that they're not supposed to put a space here or are supposed to put a space there, and that then provides sort of an answer key to their own internal dilemmas. So people have wound up dividing between phonological words, lexical words, syntactic words, grammatical words, and orthographic words, all of which seem to be the salient category, depending on what the question that's being asked is. And sometimes writing practices have been changed from above, creating problems for writers on the ground. So there's Polish, which I don't know anything about firsthand, but in the early 20th century, there were actually quite vehement orthographic debates in Polish, especially regarding the prefixing of prepositions to nouns. And there was a government-appointed orthographic committee that ruled, quote, compounds consisting of a preposition plus a noun should be spelled as two words. And you might expect such rulings to sort of pass on, without anyone paying attention. But this is in the 1920s, and people sent telegrams. And suddenly, you found out that what used to be a single word is now, by dictate from the orthographic committee, two words, which is now double the cost of sending that telegram. So there were public protests over the orthographic committee's decision, which I think is great, because we should have more public protests over orthography. Now, researchers have studied how modern people, literate and illiterate, think about words, but ancient texts actually provide an underutilized set of data that's also relevant to this question. When and how did scribes think that a word began and ended? If we go back early enough in any scribal tradition, the texts often reflect a transition period from sort of folk intuitions of what a word is to orthographic regulations. And the theoretical considerations about words can help us to understand what we find in those texts, and in turn, the textual traditions can help to inform the theory. So, I'll stay on this. As we've seen, the earliest alphabetic texts, like the Sirabit al-Khadim one I showed on the first slide, have no word dividers. The longest of the inscriptions, which is probably about 4,000 years old, has 5 lines of writing, but no indication of where any word begins or ends. So why did these writers not mark the division between words? So I mentioned this influential article by Navet, who argued that the relevant factor was not conceptual or historical, but sociolinguistic, or maybe better, socio-orthographic. that word dividers existed as long as the alphabet existed, but they were left out in texts from sites like Scribes because these were, in his words, actually graffiti. And the word divider, quote, was often neglected in short texts and non-formal scripts. So that actually, now that is he doesn't need my commendation, he's a fantastic scholar, but that particular argument actually privileges his theory over the data. Richard Steiner pointed out that the texts from Scribes are actually not graffiti. You have 5 lines of a dedicatory inscription to a goddess, so that's quite far from graffiti. They're certainly not long literary texts, that's true. But Steiner made the crucial observation, I think, that the absence of word dividers is not actually an isolated phenomenon, but one symptom of an incredibly shallow orthography in use in these inscriptions more generally. The writing reflects the sounds of the language in an almost one-to-one grapheme to phoneme system. Now, readers of English, accustomed as we are to complaining about the complexity of our writing system, the many silent letters that we have to memorize, the many different ways that we have to spell the same sound and so on, might think that a radically shallow orthography is attractive, maybe even like blissful. But there are actually profound disadvantages to such a system, and we'll touch on some of that today. But right now, one feature looms large. A profoundly, radically shallow orthography does not indicate, as spaces do in English, where one word ends and another begins. So why would the writers of the early alphabetic text adopt such a shallow, transparent orthography, which misses even this basic useful feature? It's been observed often that cultures without literary traditions tend not to have a word for word. And this has suggested to some people that the whole idea of a word is actually meaningless unless there's writing. And this is suggested, for example, by the Canadian psychologist David Olson, who develops a theory that only literacy allows a metalinguistic perspective on language. So every human being who's not pathologically disabled can speak a language, and grows up in a normal environment. But only, according to Olson, only if one learns to read and write can one learn to theorize one's own language. And part of that, for Olson, is theorizing the fact that my language consists of individual words. Now, it's clear that that's overstated. There's lots of evidence that's overstated. Anthropological evidence, ethnological evidence, and just intuitive evidence. It's actually fairly clear that you can break up your speech into words and manipulate them, even if you've never learned to read and write. And other theorists have formulated this a bit more cautiously. So anthropologist Sir Jack Goody said again more carefully. He said, "I don't mean to imply that oral speech is wordless, that morphemes cannot be and are not isolated for certain purposes, especially in the language learning phase." Right? In other words, even in an illiterate society, a teacher or a parent, more often, can tell their child that this is the word, you can say this word instead of that word, and so on. You can isolate things that we would call words. But, Goody goes on to say, I know of no word for word in either of the West African languages with which I'm reasonably familiar. So speakers know that words exist, but it may not be intuitively obvious they must be separated. So what is the status of words before writing? It turns out this is a tough question to address. Like, I would love to know empirically. In the modern world, it's harder and harder to find communities that you can actually ask such questions without any influence of writing. It's not impossible. But another way of asking it is to look at recently developed writing systems where we have data for how people who were previously illiterate develop a way of writing. And as it turns out, there are no word divisions that are marked within the Cherokee syllabary developed in the 1820s by Sequoyah, or in the Vai script of Liberia, developed in the 1830s by Momolu Dualu Bukele, nor in Silas John's Apache script of the 20th century. So all of these writing systems, which were invented by people who previously could not write and invented a system for the language in which they were native speakers, do not mark word divisions, which seems to indicate that it's not an intuitively obvious thing to do, that one needs to mark word divisions. And I should add, we have the data from the Vi text, which is on the left, which was really carefully studied by Sylvia Scribner and Michael Koller in the 1970s. So they found that even people among the Vi who were literate, who did read and write their own language using this script, which is then already 150 years old, they did not have a clear idea of where one word ended and where one word began. They did have a sense that you could chunk their language into words, but really deeply disagreed on what that actually looked like in the detail. So it's also not the case that literacy immediately gives rise to a sense of word division. So I think a far more reasonable hypothesis thinking about how word division and writing interplay is that people have an intuitive sense of words, but this is vague. It may not be put into graphic form as writing first develops, but over time, as we see in a lot of writing systems, does develop. And then there's a feedback loop. So scribes, like any speakers, will have an intuition about their words. They may try out dividing it at certain points, not dividing at other points. And then that suggests to other readers that this is how I conceive of this word. Those readers may say, I don't think of it in terms of that exactly. And then there's a process of trial and error until eventually, at some point later on, there emerges an agreed upon system of orthography, which reflects this sort of ongoing trial and error process of linguistic intuition and orthographic practice, which eventually results in a system of word division, but that's really the end of a long process. Now, there is actually a lot of evidence from the ancient world for word recognition in non-alphabetic scribal traditions. In Mesopotamia and in Egypt, where scribal cultures and traditions had been developing for more than a millennium before the alphabet was invented, and both of them included practices to recognize and divide words. For time's sake, I'm going to more or less gloss over this. I'll just mention that in Mesopotamia, there are monolingual word lists, so just lists of words, as early as the late 4th millennium BCE. So in other words, within about 200 years of the invention of writing in any form, scribes are already making lists of words. Tell me, where you'll augment this. And it's interesting that these are only nouns. So scribes are only making lists of nouns, never prepositions or verbs or adjectives or anything of the sort. And later in the Old Babylonian period, they developed bilingual and later trilingual lists, which are essentially early forms of what we might call dictionaries. And despite cuneiform scribes' familiarity, their training involves copying lists of words, they normally don't mark word divisions in actual cuneiform text. It doesn't mean they're unaware of it. So one thing that's pretty obvious is that in normal scribal texts in cuneiform, words almost never run between lines. So lines are organized to end at word divisions. So even though they don't mark word divisions, they really have a sense of where a word begins and ends, and are organizing their texts to match that tradition. Now, why are they not doing this? Why are they not marking word division? Marking word division, I'll say more about this in a second, but is a very, very useful feature for reading. And Paul Sanger, who's there on the screen, has correlated the much later classical practice of scriptura continua, as writing without spaces, with the practice of reading aloud. And the key insight that Sanger had is that in classical antiquity, reading is done with the voice. And so the divisions between words are picked up by the ear rather than by the eye, the same way that it happens in normal speech. So now I'm not pausing between words and you have no problem processing those words. If one reads aloud, the same thing happens with written texts. And there is certainly some evidence that reading in Mesopotamia was typically a verbal act. So the verb sitastum, to read, is actually a derived form of a verb whose primary meaning is to cry out, to call. And often in text, the verb shemum, literally to hear, is used for the to read as well. Why are words? So that's one possible explanation, that Akkadian scribes simply didn't feel the need to mark word division because they were reading aloud anyway, and then you obviate the need for these word divisions. So why are word dividers so useful in reading? So here, the science of reading provides really crucial context. This is Keith Rayner of blessed memory. who was a pioneer in the field of eye tracking experiments in reading. And Rayner and many colleagues showed that even though it feels typically like when we read, our eye moves smoothly across the page, it actually jumps. And these jumps, which are called saccades, French, average about 8 letters in a jump. So our eyes jump from one word roughly to another word. Short words might get only one jump. And essentially what happens is that our peripheral vision, using the spaces between words, clues in our vision system where is going to be a good place to jump to next. So how long is the next word, and therefore where should my eye jump to identify that word? Because of the visual cues that spaces provide before and after words, experienced readers land on a word and identify it as quickly as they can a single numeral. So even kids, 8 and 9 years old, can identify the word cat as quickly as they can identify the numeral 8. So in other words, they're not processing CAT, they're simply identifying it as a single grapheme. And that's possible because our eyes have jumped to the middle of that word and then pick it out. Now, of course, that whole process, which has now been studied in lots of non-Latin scripts, which provide all sorts of interesting data, but that whole process relies on our peripheral vision knowing in advance how long the word's going to be, so we can jump appropriately. For that, spaces are needed. If you don't have spaces, there's no way for the peripheral vision to actually pick out how long the next word is going to be and therefore clue the jump. So it doesn't have to be spaces, as it turns out. This is what the saccade looks like. The circles mark the jumps that an eye makes. You see, it's not always one word, but it doesn't have to be spaces. So this, words which are alternating bold and not bold, can be processed just as quickly as writing with spaces for the same reason. Your peripheral vision has enough clue to know where the word's going to end and therefore how to jump. You can do it with colors also. I won't belabor this, but this is actually a local craftsman, Lita Lopez Cardozo Kindersley, whose workshop is a little bit farther north in Cambridge. This is actually two copies of the same sign that she made. And she intuitively realized that she needed to leave spaces in the monochromatic version that she could dispense with in the polychromatic version. She didn't look into the science of reading, she just realized that it's really hard to read monochromatic writing without spaces. So there's actually no space in the polychromatic one because she realized it wasn't necessary. So there's lots of ways of sort of cluing in the visual system where a word begins and ends, but in our system, spaces are the default way of doing it. Now, all of these different ones are actually relevant. I think I'm gonna have to skip this for time's sake, but relevant for thinking about Egyptian writing, which does typically end every word with obligatory classifiers. And there is some evidence that those classifiers may have actually been enough if if one is a trained reader, so that they're visually distinct to the brain, that might actually be enough to sort of clue the peripheral vision in that this is the end of a word, and therefore I can read more quickly than I can, for example, in cuneiform. But I'll have to leave that for now. So to summarize the evidence here, two major Near Eastern writing systems diverged when it came to the question of word dividers before the alphabet. Generally speaking, there's a lot more nuance that I could introduce, but generally speaking, cuneiform did not visually mark division between words, which would have made rapid silent reading, difficult. But Egyptian writing built word division into the writing system essentially from the beginning, and this may have enabled scribes to identify words more quickly and read with fluency even unfamiliar texts. So with that background, we can return to the early alphabetic inscriptions. So I mentioned that Navet correlated the lack of word dividers with the genre of the text, which he called graffiti. Steiner is certainly correct that the details there are imprecise. It's clearly not graffiti, but Navet was onto something in linking the manner of writing with the reason for writing. And that's what I want to dwell on for a moment here. The key point is that they're not graffiti, but they're also not literary texts meant for archival consultation. All of the early texts are actually either dedicatory inscriptions to a goddess in the Koller, I'm sorry, goddess Koller, in Sirab al-Khadim, or even less formal texts like writing one's name, which might plausibly be called graffiti, although I think that word has a sort of a more specific meaning in other contexts, so I would want to avoid it there anyway. But when you think about the genres of these texts, the interesting, I think, insight is that these inscriptions were not meant to be read out loud or silent. They were actually not meant to be read at all. So these inscriptions are actually meant to be written, but never read, at least not by people, maybe goddesses. And that suggests that this is all of the early alphabetic texts that we have. It suggests that the alphabet may have been invented, developed, to be written but not read by people. So in our sort of hyper-literate, hypertextual society, where we're constantly writing and reading to each other, this seems very foreign. We do, of course, write for ourselves, like to-do lists and notes and things like that, or drafted papers that one might read out loud. But these are still meant to be read. Writing that's never meant to be read is certainly more rare. It can be found in the practice of journaling, and maybe more similar to something like a dedicatory inscription, the practice, it's not only here, but this is one prominent example, where worshipers write notes and put them in places of pilgrimage. This is the Western Wall in Jerusalem, where, I don't know how often, but the people in charge collect thousands and thousands of notes that are there that are never meant to be read, and they're explicitly not meant to be read. This, is rarely in the news, but when then Senator Obama wrote a note and it was pilfered by a student who sold it to an Israeli newspaper, the Rabbi Shmuel Rabinowitz, who supervised the Western Wall, said, "Notes which are placed in the Western Wall are between the person and their maker. Heaven forbid that another person should read them or use them in any way." So this is a good example of writing that's simply not meant for human eyes. And this is, I think, very similar to a dedicatory inscription in a temple. Now, of course, in Sirab al-Khadim, it's not that they expected confidentiality. On the contrary, they're very happy if other people notice that they dedicated a statue to the goddess. But there is no intended human audience for these texts. The primary audience is either no one or a divine being. So while we don't, to my knowledge, have any specific knowledge of Koller's literary skills, it seems reasonable that you could read without spacing. And so the principle of writing for purposes other than human reading holds true for all of the early alphabetic texts. There's not a single early alphabetic text that is meant to be consumed by another human being. So in light of this, I think it's worth thinking, I'm just going to sort of throw this out without fully developing it. It's worth thinking about the early alphabet as a disruptive innovation. And when it was first developed, the alphabet was not meant to compete with fully functioning writing systems like cuneiform and hieroglyphs or hieratic, which already were in the region. Instead, it was designed to be as simple as possible to write. One sign per sound, one grapheme per phoneme, so as easy as possible to learn and to use. And really difficult to read, but that's irrelevant to the purpose of the alphabet. In other words, if you want to write something for someone else to read, I go to my hieratic scribe or my cuneiform scribe. This is something new. This is meant to do something entirely different. It's meant to be an easy way for people who are probably not otherwise literate to write their names or to preserve their memories on texts that are not meant to be read by other humans. So the early alphabet may actually be the easiest script to write that's ever been developed, but it was and still is actually really difficult to read because it simply wasn't meant for that. Long text on papyrus, like archival or literary or something like that, would have been entirely inappropriate in such a script, and that's why we don't have such things. Over the following centuries, like other disruptive innovations, over the following centuries, the alphabet was modified in important ways, and 1,000 years later, those developments, including the introduction of word dividers, enabled the alphabet to be used for other purposes, and then to compete with the established leaders in the field, like cuneiform and hieratic. Now, the introduction of word dividers took place relatively quickly, actually. there are alphabetic inscriptions from 3 sites before the year 1700 BCE. Wadi al-Hol, which is down in southern southern Egypt, I'm sorry, and has 2 graffiti alphabetic inscriptions. Tharabat al-Khadim, which has 12 texts, and the recently published Lyscombe from Lachish. None of these pre-1700 texts have divisions between words. It's not surprising, though, I think, that in the following centuries, word dividers began to be used. It's a natural improvement in the alphabet as a system, especially if you're going to try to read the alphabet. So the earliest known example, maybe the Tel Nagila sherd, dating maybe to the 16th century, which has a clear, bold, short vertical sign between the yuds on the left. And a similar sign is on this 13th century bull from Lachish, which I can't point at, that's right there, the second to the last sign, following the word Bishloshet. And there's also a contemporary ewer from Lachish that also has word dividers. In the same century, the 13th century, maybe even a little earlier, scribes up in Ugarit use a vertical wedge, maybe related to that vertical stroke over there, to divide words in their novel cuneiform inflected alphabet. So by the late Bronze Age, most texts in alphabetic writing show marker of word divisions. 3 dots, 1 dot, a wedge, a line. And it's easy to observe the introduction of word dividers. It's much more difficult to discern the rules governing its use. Monoconsonantal prefixes in Ugaritic are typically not separated from the following word by a word divider. Krellin, in his book, concluded that within Ugaritic, there's evidence of at least 3 different schools of thought on how to divide words. And in large part, this is the point I really want to emphasize, this is because the introduction of word dividers demands an answer to the question that hadn't yet been explicitly asked. What exactly is a word? And since there was no correct or obvious answer to that question, they then developed various traditions regarding how to use word dividers. In the Iron Age, we see clear patterns, but also a lot of diversity. And the point I want to emphasize is that inconsistency here is not only a question of scribal traditions, geographic variation, or anything of the sort. It's endemic to the fuzziness of the category of word. So throughout the Iron Age, Northwest Semitic corpus, Phoenician, Aramaic, Hebrew, Moabite, a couple others, the use of word dividers is clear and generally present. A significant category of exceptions are monosyllabic words, which are often written together with the following word, especially if the word is in the construct state. So if you're in Semitic, that'll be obvious, but you can see it in the translation here. So you have something like Beit David, house of David, that winds up being written without a word divider in between, or Bar, Bir, Beor, son of Beor, again, without any sort of word divider, even though the rest of the text from which these phrases are taken are marked with clear word dividers. In Phoenician, I won't go through all these examples, but you can see the examples here. Now, I want to emphasize this is not a dialectal issue because it's not consistent within any dialect. It's just inconsistent, and that's not unreasonable because scribes and speakers would have noticed that something like the 4th example there, Malk Gival, king of Byblos, is syntactically parallel to something like Malki, my king. So they'd say, well, if Malki is written as one word, shouldn't Malkival be written as one word? So sometimes they do. Interestingly, some Aramaic scribes actually argue the analogy in the opposite direction. If construct phrases are sometimes written as 2 words, so let's say the camp of the enemy might be written as 2 words, well, what about the camp of them? Why is that 1 word? Maybe it should be 2 words. And so they mark it as 2 words, machanat, home, their encampments. So some scholars have argued that because of examples like that, this is not really a word divider, something else. But I would say, no, it is a word divider. It's just don't impose on the scribes your conception of what a word is. So the fact that a modern grammar book calls this a suffix, possessive suffix, doesn't mean that the ancient scribes thought of it as a suffix. They simply thought of it as a pronoun that indicated possession, and that might be a separate word. There are graphic considerations as well. So scribes seem to have fairly early on hit on the idea that single letters should not be marked as separate words. which again is not intuitively obvious. In English, we have no such word, no such rule, for example. So therefore, even syntactically similar things like prepositions, if they were written as one letter, they were prefixed. If they were written as two letters, they were sometimes prefixed. If they were written as three letters, they were never prefixed. Not only prepositions, but I won't go through these examples. Now, later in the Iron Age, I'm going to just do one more piece of evidence, and then I'll get to the conclusion. Later in the Iron Age, we have a large corpora really of ostraka, Hebrew ostraka, from the sites of Arad and Lachish. And here we have a lot of data for asking how words were perceived and written, divided. And here again, there's a high degree of inconsistency, but there's still patterns that can be discerned. I'm not going to go through them right now. The most interesting phenomenon I want to single out here is the phenomenon of where two words, which again end with the first word ends with the same letter the second word begins with, wind up being written as one word, with that letter being written only once. So, for example, the chi yomar, where the chi ends with a yod, and yomar begins with a yod, and so the scribe here, this is a really sort of a letter that gets a lot of attention called Lachish 3, writes it as one word. Now, what's interesting is that so it would be like in English writing green neck for a third day. Whether you might say it that way, but you'd of course learn not to write it that way. But this I want to call him a scribe because he obviously writes the letter, but he is clearly not a trained scribe. So he hasn't learned spelling practices, basically. He knows Hebrew, he knows how to write, but no one's taught him. This is what a word, and you have to leave a space over here, and then you write a separate word. So he writes it as it seems to him appropriate to write. So this is sort of in the position of the Pole after those orthographic reforms in the 1920s. Speak Polish, I know how to write my language, but no one's told me the sort of most recent scribal rules that like, here's how we divide words from now on. Now, the author of, the reason we are interested in the author of Lachish 3 is that he explicitly is arguing in the letter that he knows how to read and write, but someone has accused him of not knowing how to read. So it's fairly clear that he's not a trained scribe, and yet he can write. So that's kind of exactly the profile of someone who I think is really fascinating for this kind of question. So he knows the language, and he has intuitions about words, but he doesn't know all of the rules. So he writes certain words together that a trained scribe would have written as separate words. There's actually a parallel in a really interesting Neo-Assyrian letter where we have someone who says, I have no scribe, so let the king order to send me a scribe so that I can write. But of course, he's writing a letter. So he can write a letter, he's literate, but he has no trained scribe. And in fact, as Parpola pointed out in that article on the slide, the orthography of that letter is highly non-standard Neo-Assyrian orthography. So he writes like wrongly by scribal standards, but perfectly comprehensively. Like anyone can read what he writes. He's simply writing phonetically. So he writes it out as it sounds to him, which is actually great for us because you actually get information about what the language sounded like, not covered up by professional scribal training. All right. So later on in the 7th century, we actually get spacing for the first time as a method of systematically dividing words. That, of course, becomes the standard in Aramaic, and because the Persians use Aramaic as their imperial language, this sort of practice spreads throughout the Persian Empire and therefore throughout essentially the entire Middle East. I'll leave that aside. So you see that very clearly in the Aramaic of Persian Empire. But I want to move on to the last point as a conclusion. The transition to a fully developed system of word division was supported by, and then in turn supported, the conceptualization of what a word is. And that's really the feedback loop that I want to emphasize here. So evidence for this conceptualization comes from the word for word itself. As I mentioned earlier, languages without a literary tradition often don't have a word for word, but that's also true of many cultures that do have literary tradition, like ancient Greek and ancient Hebrew, which don't have specific words for word early on in those traditions. It just takes time for the lexicon to catch up to practice. So in Greek, Little Scott and Jones, note that logos means primarily in this meaning, verbal expression or utterance, rarely a single word. In Homer, epos means speech, often contrasted with words for deed or doing. Later, though, this takes on the meaning word. Aristophanes and Frogs use the expression katepos, word by word, way of talking. And similar usages are found in other 5th century authors. Lexis, which is used by Plato for speech as the opposite of oide, song, becomes later on, in later authors, again, a word to refer to specific words. Biblical Hebrew davar means thing, most basically, but often speech or utterance. So for example, the short collection that's known in English as the 10 Commandments is in the Bible itself called the 10 Devarim, davar. When a reference to something said by someone, when davar is used for that, it's almost always in the plural. And so there's no context in which davar means word, like a single word. On the other hand, Aramaic developed that usage really early on. Back in the 8th century BCE, a treaty from Sephire has the phrase Chada min milei sifra zina. Min milei sifra vina, I guess. One of the words of this text. And that word milah becomes the common word for word throughout the rest of Aramaic as well. Ancient Aramaic, anyway. In early rabbinic Hebrew, the word davar does some interesting things, but then a new word is developed for the word word, and that's the word teva. Teva originally meant box. So Richard Steiner again observed that the metaphor involved in this word means that teva for word is apparently defined purely visually, graphically. It's a box, meaning it's defined by the spaces before, after, above, below. And so it's a lot less ambiguous, actually, than the English word. Not only the etymology, but the usage of it, you have some on the slide there, make it clear that teva means specifically a graphic word that would be found written by scribes in a text. So you have, for example, rabbinic scribal words that mandate, ben teva leteva kimlo, that one must leave in between one teva, one word, and the next teva, a space the size of a letter. So clearly we're not talking about phonological words or syntactic words, we're talking about literally orthographic words. And there are others as well. The key point is that in a culture that spends a lot of time with written words, it's natural for a vocabulary to develop to describe those kinds of words. And in Hebrew, that word was a teva, referring to the shape of a word. There was then, the rabbis developed a 3-way distinction in text between otiyot, signs, but letters, tevot, words, in other words, graphic words, and sentences, psukim, which are marked differently. And the shift from biblical divarim, speech, primarily oral, not dissolved into constituent lexical parts, to rabbinic tevot, words on a page defined as a box, visually, defined by the spaces before and after really reflects a massive shift in the conceptualization of language, essentially development and definition of the idea word. Thank you.